The sun blazed mercilessly over the dusty town of Redemption Creek as Jack Sullivan rode his weathered horse down the main street. His leather boots were cracked from months of desert travel, and his hat was pulled low over eyes that had seen too much suffering. The townspeople watched him with suspicious glances, whispering among themselves about the stranger who carried himself like a man running from ghosts. Jack had been drifting through the Borderlands for 3 years now, ever since the incident that changed his life forever. He wasn't looking for trouble, but trouble had a way of finding him in these lawless territories where justice was often decided by whoever had the fastest gun or the deepest pockets. As he dismounted near the saloon, Jack noticed a commotion near the town square. A crowd had gathered around a wooden platform where 3 young Apache women stood with ropes around their necks. Their dark eyes showed no fear, only defiance, even as the townspeople jeered and called for their execution. Sheriff Wade Hutchins stood on the platform, his badge gleaming in the harsh sunlight. He was a man who enjoyed his power, and his cruel smile told Jack everything he needed to know about the kind of justice served in Redemption Creek. "These savage women murdered innocent settlers," the sheriff announced to the crowd. "They burned down the Morrison homestead and killed an entire family, including 2 young children." Jack studied the 3 women carefully. The eldest couldn't have been more than 25, with long black hair braided with small stones and feathers. Her name was Ayanna, which meant eternal blossom in her native tongue. Beside her stood Kaya, barely 18, whose eyes burned with the fire of youth and injustice. The third was Nayeli, only 16, who kept her chin raised high despite the tears that threatened to fall. Something didn't sit right with Jack about this whole scene. He had encountered many Apache people in his travels, and while conflicts were common on the frontier, the deliberate targeting of children was not part of their warrior code. These women looked like they had been living rough for weeks, their traditional clothing torn and dirty, their faces bearing the marks of harsh treatment. Jack approached an old-timer sitting on the porch of the general store. The man was carving a piece of wood with trembling hands, occasionally glancing nervously at the execution platform. "Mighty quick trial for such serious charges," Jack observed casually, settling beside the elderly man. The old-timer, whose name was Pete Connors, looked around nervously before leaning closer. "Wasn't much of a trial at all, stranger. Sheriff Hutchins and his men brought these girls in yesterday, already beaten half to death. Judge Morrison signed their death warrant without hearing a word from them." "Morrison?" Jack's interest sharpened. "Any relation to the family that was supposedly killed?" Pete nodded grimly. "Judge Morrison is the older brother of the man who died. Lost his nephew and niece, too, poor souls. But there's something you should know about what really happened out at that homestead." Before Pete could continue, Sheriff Hutchins called for attention. "We'll carry out this execution at sunset as is proper. These murderers will pay for their crimes against decent Christian folk." Jack noticed how the 3 Apache women exchanged glances, and he saw something in their eyes that confirmed his growing suspicions. They weren't the cold-blooded killers the sheriff claimed them to be. If anything, they looked like victims themselves. As the crowd began to disperse, Jack noticed several men in expensive suits watching from the shade of a nearby building. They didn't look like typical frontier settlers or ranchers. Their clothes were too clean, their boots too polished, and they carried themselves with the arrogance of men who were used to getting their way through money and influence. One of them, a tall man with silver hair and a perfectly waxed mustache, caught Jack's attention. He was speaking quietly to Sheriff Hutchins, occasionally gesturing toward the 3 condemned women. Jack couldn't hear their conversation, but the exchange of a small leather pouch told him everything he needed to know about the true nature of justice in Redemption Creek. That evening, as shadows grew long across the desert landscape, Jack found himself in the Dusty Rose Saloon, nursing a whiskey and listening to the conversations around him. The bartender, a woman named Rosa Martinez, had kind eyes, but spoke in hushed tones when she thought no one was listening. "Those poor girls don't deserve what's coming to them," she whispered to Jack when she refilled his glass. "My cousin Maria works as a servant for Judge Morrison. She heard things that would make your blood run cold." Jack leaned forward slightly. "What kind of things?" Rosa glanced around the nearly empty saloon before continuing. "The Morrison family wasn't killed by Apache raiders. Maria heard the judge and that fancy businessman, Mr. Sterling, talking about covering up what really happened. Something about a land deal gone wrong and witnesses that needed to be silenced." The pieces were starting to come together in Jack's mind. He had seen this pattern before in other frontier towns, powerful men using fear and prejudice to cover up their own crimes. The Apache women were convenient scapegoats, their lives deemed worthless by people who saw them as nothing more than obstacles to progress and profit. As midnight approached, Jack made his decision. He couldn't stand by and watch 3 innocent women die for crimes they didn't commit. Especially when the real killers were walking free and counting their blood money. He slipped out of the saloon and made his way through the quiet streets toward the jail. The building was old and poorly constructed, with thick adobe walls but weak wooden doors. 2 guards sat on the front porch, playing cards by lamplight and passing a bottle of rot-gut whiskey between them. Jack circled around to the back of the jail, where a single barred window provided the only ventilation for the cells. He could hear the soft voices of the 3 women inside, speaking in their native language. Though he didn't understand the words, the tone told him they were saying farewell to each other and preparing to meet their ancestors with honor. Using his knife, Jack began working on the old mortar around the window bars. Years of desert heat and cold had weakened the adobe, and the iron bars were already loose in their settings. It would take time and patience, but he could get them free if he was careful and quiet. As he worked, Jack thought about his own past and the injustices he had witnessed throughout his years in the Borderlands. He had failed to save innocent people before, and those failures haunted him every night. But tonight, perhaps he could make a difference. Tonight, 3 young women might live to see another sunrise because one drifter decided to do what was right instead of what was safe. The stars wheeled overhead as Jack continued his careful work, knowing that dawn would bring either freedom or disaster for them all. By 3 in the morning, Jack had loosened enough mortar to pull one of the iron bars free from the window. The metal scraped softly against the adobe as he worked it back and forth, each sound making him freeze and listen for any sign that the guards had heard. But the 2 men on the front porch were deep in their cups now, their voices slurred as they argued about a poker hand from the previous week. Inside the cell, Ayanna had noticed the movement at the window. She whispered quietly to her companions, and all 3 women moved closer to see who was working to free them. When Jack's face appeared in the moonlight streaming through the gap, Ayanna studied him with intelligent dark eyes. "Why do you help us, white man?" she asked in careful English, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack paused in his work to meet her gaze. "Because innocent people don't deserve to die for crimes they didn't commit. And because I've seen what men like Sheriff Hutchins and his friends do to anyone who gets in their way." Kaya stepped forward, her young face hardened by experiences no teenager should have endured. "You know we did not kill the Morrison family?" "I know enough," Jack replied, resuming his work on the second bar. "I know that the real killers are counting their money while you 3 are blamed for their crimes. That's all I need to know." As the second bar came loose, Jack created an opening just wide enough for the women to squeeze through. He had already scouted their escape route across the rocky ground behind the jail, through a dry creek bed, and into the maze of boulders and canyons that surrounded Redemption Creek. Ayanna went first, moving with the fluid grace of someone who had spent her entire life in the harsh desert environment. She helped pull Nayeli through the window while Kaya squeezed out last, her eyes constantly watching for any sign of danger. Jack led them away from the jail, moving carefully through the shadows cast by the full moon. They had perhaps 4 hours before the guards would discover the empty cells, and then all hell would break loose. The desert would offer them protection, but only if they could reach the deep canyons before sunrise. As they traveled, Ayanna told Jack the truth about what had happened at the Morrison homestead. Her voice was quiet but steady as she revealed the real story behind the massacre that had condemned them to death. "We were traveling to meet with other bands of our people when we saw the smoke," she explained as they picked their way through a field of weathered stones. "The house was already burning when we arrived. We found the bodies of the man and his wife and the 2 children hiding in the root cellar." Kaya added her own details to the story. The children were terrified. They had seen men in dark suits kill their parents, men who spoke of papers and signatures and land that must be taken quickly. "The little boy, he told us his father had refused to sell their land to bad men," Nayeli whispered, her voice catching with emotion. "He said the men became angry and started shooting." Jack felt his jaw tighten as the picture became clearer. "So you tried to help the children." "We were bringing them to safety when the sheriff's men surrounded us," Ayanna continued. "They shot first and asked questions later. We fought back because we had to protect the young ones. But there were too many guns." "What happened to the children?" Jack asked, though he feared he already knew the answer. The 3 women exchanged sorrowful looks. "They were taken by the men in suits," Kaya said quietly. "We heard them screaming as we were dragged away to jail. That was 3 days ago. We have not seen them since." Jack's blood ran cold. Those children were the only witnesses who could prove the Apache women's innocence and expose the real killers. If Sterling and his associates had taken them, those young lives were probably already forfeit. They traveled through the night, following ancient paths that Ayanna knew from childhood hunting trips with her father. The desert landscape was harsh and unforgiving, filled with rattlesnakes, scorpions, and other dangers that could kill the unwary. But it also provided countless hiding places for those who understood its secrets. As dawn approached, they took shelter in a shallow cave hidden among towering rock formations. Jack rationed out water from his canteen while the women shared dried meat they had hidden in their clothing before their capture. "You have risked your life for strangers," Ayanna observed as they rested in the cool darkness of the cave. "This is not something most white men would do." Jack stared out at the lightening sky, thinking of his own painful history. "I had a family once, a wife and daughter. They were killed by men who thought their lives didn't matter because they were different. I wasn't able to save them, but maybe I can save you." The women listened in respectful silence as Jack shared pieces of his past. His wife had been Mexican, and their daughter was caught between 2 worlds in a time when such mixing was often met with violence. When land developers had wanted their small ranch, they had used fear and hatred to turn the community against Jack's family. By the time he realized the danger, it was too late. "That's why I understand what's really happening here," Jack continued. "Sterling and his friends want the land that belongs to your people. They're using fear to drive you away or kill you off completely." The Morrison family must have stood in their way somehow. As the morning heat began to build outside their hiding place, Jack knew they needed a plan that went beyond simple survival. The 3 women would never be safe as long as the real killers walked free and the truth remained buried. They needed proof of Sterling's crimes, and they needed it soon. "There's a way to clear your names," Jack said finally. "But it means going back toward Redemption Creek, and it means taking risks that could get us all killed." Ayanna nodded grimly. "We are already condemned to die. What is your plan?" Jack outlined his idea. Sterling and his associates would be confident now, believing they had successfully eliminated the witnesses to their crimes. That confidence might make them careless. If Jack could get close enough to overhear their conversations or find documents related to their land schemes, he might be able to gather the evidence needed to expose them. "The children," Nayeli said suddenly. "If they are still alive, they will be hidden somewhere nearby. Sterling cannot take them far without drawing attention." Jack realized she was right. The businessman would need to keep the children close enough to control them, but hidden enough that no one would ask questions. That meant a location somewhere between Redemption Creek and the vast emptiness of the open desert. "There's an old mining camp about 10 miles north of town," Jack mused. "It's been abandoned for years, but the buildings are still standing. It would be the perfect place to hold prisoners without anyone knowing." They spent the day planning their next moves. As dangerous as it was, they would have to split up. The women would use their knowledge of the desert to scout the old mining camp and look for signs of the missing children. Meanwhile, Jack would return to Redemption Creek under cover of darkness to gather intelligence on Sterling's operation. When evening came, they prepared to leave their rocky shelter. Jack checked his guns and made sure his horse was ready for hard riding. The 3 Apache women prepared in their own way, painting their faces with traditional symbols and singing quiet songs that honored their ancestors and asked for protection in the trials ahead. As they prepared to part ways, Ayanna placed her hand on Jack's shoulder. "If we do not survive this night, know that you have given us the chance to die with honor instead of shame. That is a gift beyond price." Jack nodded, understanding the gravity of what they were about to attempt. "If things go wrong, head for the old Spanish mission ruins 20 miles south. I'll find you there." With those words, they disappeared into the desert darkness, each carrying the hopes of the others as they moved toward what might be their final confrontation with the forces of greed and corruption that had already claimed so many innocent lives. Jack rode hard through the desert night, his horse's hooves drumming a steady rhythm against the packed earth. The moon was bright enough to light his way, but he stayed off the main trails, following deer paths and dry creek beds that would make him harder to track if anyone came looking. By midnight, he had circled around to approach Redemption Creek from the east, where a cluster of expensive tents had been set up for Sterling and his business associates. These weren't the rough canvas shelters of ordinary travelers, but elaborate affairs with wooden floors and oil lamps that cast long shadows across the desert floor. Jack left his horse tied to a mesquite tree about half a mile away and approached the camp on foot. The desert air carried voices clearly, and he could hear men talking and laughing around a campfire. As he crept closer, hidden behind sagebrush and boulder formations, the words became distinct. Sterling was there, still dressed in his expensive suit despite the late hour. With him were 2 other men Jack didn't recognize, and Judge Morrison, whose grief seemed to have been replaced by cold calculation. "The execution should have taken place this afternoon," one of the strangers was saying. His voice carried a slight accent that Jack couldn't place. "Why the delay?" Sheriff Hutchins emerged from one of the tents, his face flushed with anger and whiskey. "The prisoners escaped sometime during the night. My men are tracking them, but they disappeared into the canyon country. Could take days to find them in all that rock." Sterling's response was swift and harsh. "This is exactly the kind of incompetence I warned you about, Sheriff. Those women were the only link between us and the Morrison incident. With them dead, we could have proceeded with the land acquisition without further complications." Judge Morrison poured himself another drink from an expensive bottle. "Perhaps it's better this way. Dead martyrs sometimes cause more trouble than live prisoners. If they die in the desert, it looks like natural justice rather than execution." Jack pressed himself closer to the rocks, hardly daring to breathe as the men continued their conversation. What he heard next made his blood boil with righteous anger. "What about the Morrison children?" Sterling asked casually, as if discussing livestock rather than human lives. "Still secured at the old mining camp," Sheriff Hutchins replied. "The boy keeps asking for his parents, But the girl hasn't spoken a word since we brought them there. They're starting to become a problem. The man with the accent leaned forward into the firelight. Perhaps it's time to solve that problem permanently. Children have such fragile constitutions. Accidents happen so easily in the wilderness. Jack's hand moved instinctively to his gun, but he forced himself to remain still. He needed to hear everything before making his move. These men were casually discussing the murder of children as if they were planning a business transaction. The land deal must be completed within the week, Sterling continued. Senator Williams is expecting his share of the profits, and he's already arranged for the railroad survey to begin. We can't afford any more delays or complications. Judge Morrison nodded gravely. Once we eliminate the remaining witnesses, there will be no one left to challenge our claim to the Apache lands. The mineral rights alone are worth more than this entire territory. As Jack listened, the full scope of Sterling's criminal enterprise became clear. This wasn't just about the Morrison homestead or even the immediate Apache lands. Sterling and his associates were systematically driving out or killing anyone who stood in the way of a massive land grab that would net them millions of dollars in mining and railroad profits. The Apache people were being portrayed as savage raiders to justify their removal or extermination. Settlers who refused to sell their land were being murdered and their deaths blamed on Indian attacks. Even government officials were being bought or threatened to ensure their cooperation. Jack had heard enough. He began backing away from the camp, planning to retrieve his horse and ride immediately to the old mining camp where the children were being held. But as he turned to leave, his boot knocked against a loose stone that clattered down the rocky slope. "What was that?" Sheriff Hutchins called out, his hand moving to his gun. Jack froze, pressing himself against the rocks and hoping the shadows would hide him. For long seconds, the only sound was the crackling of the campfire and the distant howl of a coyote. "Probably just a desert fox or jackrabbit," Sterling said finally. "This country is full of vermin." Jack waited until the conversation resumed before carefully making his way back to his horse. Every step had to be silent and deliberate, but he managed to reach his mount without further incident. As he rode away from Sterling's camp, his mind was already working on the next phase of his plan. The old mining camp lay in a narrow valley surrounded by steep hills that made approach difficult but not impossible. Jack knew the area from his wandering years, when he had sometimes sheltered there during severe weather. The main buildings were constructed of stone and thick timber, designed to withstand harsh conditions, but also easily defensible against attack. He approached from the south, where an old supply trail wound between towering rock formations. In the distance, he could see the flicker of lamplight in what used to be the mine foreman's office. Two men sat outside the building, rifles across their laps, obviously guarding whatever was inside. Jack circled around to the back of the building complex, where a narrow drainage ditch provided cover almost to the walls of the old bunkhouse. From there, he could hear the soft voices of children somewhere in the darkness. Moving carefully along the ditch, he found a broken board in the rear wall of the bunkhouse where he could peer inside. In the dim light from a single candle, he saw them. A boy of perhaps 8 years old, and a girl who couldn't have been more than 6. They were huddled together on a pile of old blankets, the boy's arm protectively around his little sister. Jack's heart nearly broke at the sight. These children had watched their parents die and been held captive for days by the very men who had committed that terrible crime. Yet somehow they had found the strength to comfort each other in their terror. The boy looked up suddenly, as if sensing Jack's presence. Their eyes met through the gap in the wall, and Jack saw recognition dawn on the child's face. He pressed a finger to his lips, signaling for silence, then held up his hand to indicate they should wait. Jack knew he couldn't take on both guards alone without risking the children's lives, but as he watched and waited, an idea began to form. The guards were relaxed, confident that no rescue attempt would come for two supposedly savage Apache women who had supposedly murdered the children's family. That confidence would be their downfall. Meanwhile, 10 miles away at the old mining camp that Jack was approaching, Ayanna and her companions had discovered disturbing evidence of Sterling's larger conspiracy. Hidden in an abandoned mine shaft, they found crates of weapons marked with military serial numbers, along with documents that revealed the true scope of the land grab scheme. The papers showed detailed maps of Apache territory with mineral deposits clearly marked, along with correspondence between Sterling and various government officials discussing the Indian problem and its final solution. There were also forged documents claiming Apache raids on settlements that had actually been attacked by Sterling's hired killers. But most damning of all was a letter from Senator Williams explicitly authorizing the elimination of any obstacles, human or otherwise, that stood in the way of the railroad development project. As Kaya examined the documents by moonlight, she realized they held the evidence needed to expose the entire conspiracy. But they also revealed how extensive and powerful Sterling's network really was. This wasn't just a local crime. It was a coordinated effort involving politicians, judges, and businessmen across multiple territories. "We must get this evidence to honest authorities," Ayanna whispered, as they prepared to leave the mine shaft. "But who can we trust when corruption reaches so high?" Nayeli had been keeping watch at the entrance to the mine. "Someone comes," she hissed. "Many horses moving fast." The three women quickly gathered the most important documents and weapons they could carry, then slipped out of the mine and into the maze of rocks and abandoned equipment that surrounded the old camp. Behind them, they could hear the sound of approaching riders and shouted orders. Sheriff Hutchins had brought a full posse to search the old mining camp, following tracks that led from the women's last known position. But Ayanna and her companions knew this country better than any white tracker. They moved like shadows through terrain that would have challenged an experienced hunter in full daylight. As they made their escape, Ayanna felt a grim satisfaction. They now possessed the evidence that would clear their names and expose Sterling's crimes. But she also knew that the real battle was just beginning. Sterling and his associates wouldn't give up their profitable scheme without a fight, and they had already shown they were willing to kill anyone who stood in their way. The race was on to reach honest authorities before Sterling could eliminate all the witnesses and complete his land grab. And somewhere in the darkness, Jack was making his own desperate attempt to rescue the Morrison children and gather the final proof needed to bring down the entire conspiracy. As dawn approached, all the players in this deadly game were moving toward a final confrontation that would determine not just their own fates, but the future of all the innocent people caught in the web of greed and corruption that had already claimed so many lives. The desert would witness one last act of justice before the sun rose on a new day.